Well, of course, Jim, you know what time it is. We got to talk about the thing everyone's been talking about on Netflix. Everyone's been rushing over there since the stroke of 3 a.m. to
The
see
stroke of 3.
the Dump Matsumoto documentary series. Have you watched it? What did you think?
Oh, come on. You don't be swerving these people around here, Brian
Well,
Lass.
no,
You know
you're
what the
right.
people want. We got
That's
to give the
right.
people what they want.
I'm going to talk about a different kind of dump. No, see, I can't even make that transition. But what we're going to talk about today is episode 1. Well, we're going to talk about all of them, I guess. But let's start with episode 1 of the brand new Vince McMahon Netflix docuseries entitled Mr. McMahon.
Well, do you know what the title of episode number 1 was? Did you notice that?
That was probably the first thing that made Vince unhappy when he screened the show, I would imagine, right?
Junior. And for everybody that knows Vince or knows anything about Vince, he despises being called Junior and Vince Jr. There's been so much made in modern times of his father was Vincent James McMahon, and he is Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And that's one of his things. That's along with don't say belt and don't say wrestling and don't sneeze and all the other, famous Vince Picadillos is, and Vinny too, because that's what the boys called him when he first started coming around. We'll talk about this in a second that, he goes over that he didn't meet his father till he was 12 or whatever. But when he was older teenager, got out of, the military school or whatever, and he started coming around, the boys and all of Vince seniors, business associates called him Vinny. And that was almost as bad as Junior.
I like to think whenever he hears or whenever he sees those words, he thinks of Albano yelling it. Because he would combine the two. Vinny Jr.!
It's Vinny Jr.! It's Vinny Jr.! But there's, right off the bat at the top of this thing, they made plain there's going to be no shortage of star power because they just showed the talking heads sitting down for the sit-down interviews, preparing whatever. That Rock had a plate of food in his lap. I didn't see a giant Gatorade bottle full of yellow liquid, but
Gewurz had that.
There's the biggest names in the wrestling business that they teased us with, from Cena, Rock, Austin, Undertaker, all the way on down, and the family, Stephanie, Shane, and Linda. Does Linda look better now, or not better, but younger now than she did 20 years ago?
Well, clearly her plastic surgeon does better work than Vince's.
Well, I'm telling you, I mean, besides the fact that, with that last facelift, you could tell because the nipples were on her chin. She's smoother. She's plumper. She always looked a little gaunt to me. Like she probably around the house there, she didn't get to snack on any fatty foods or whatever. But yeah, how old is she now? She got to be 74 or 5?
She's 96 years old.
Oh, come on.
Now, hold on, let me see. Linda McMahon.
But she looked older 20 years ago when they were trying to force her to be on television.
75 years old, and I apologize for the noise of the gardeners.
Oh, good Lord. All right, so they had Vince get in the ring. They're doing his sit down in a ring in a warehouse, the motif there, the look. But when they showed him getting in the ring, stepping through the ropes and sitting down, he didn't have the spring in his step. He stooped over. He had the hair dye. He didn't have the mustache, but the eyebrows looked like they had taken on a life of their own. He looked like Ernie Kovacs.
His lips were purple.
Yeah.
I noticed that too.
The voice is a growl. I don't know whether it's from the constant overuse of the Mr. McMahon projection voice, Aretha Franklin, or whether it was the steroids or growth hormone or whatever. That's why certain of these women bodybuilders, they sound like Minnie Mouse when they're teenagers, and then they sound like Vince when they're 35 or whatever. And then, and also age. But I think that's why he hasn't been able to get out of any of the things he hadn't been able to get out of the last couple of years, because he's not the young Vince with the voice and standing up straight. We've talked about it before, that age, erosion set in. But God damn it, you never expected him to be in any way, shape, or form show any feebility. What is that?
And again, what we're seeing is him sitting in a ring. You saw him enter the ring, but we're seeing him sit in the ring and answer questions. What we're not seeing is his handlers, him shuffling there with his handlers, being fed things that he may have forgotten. Like, we're not seeing any of that. This is the finished product.
And he said, I've never talked about me. Well, he doesn't say it that good anymore. I've never talked about me. I haven't quite figured out who I am yet. But when they showed...
There were a lot of early quotes there that, because of everything that came out after they had started filming, and obviously that's why they edited it the way they did, it takes on a double meaning.
Yeah. And, when you kind of know the finish, it stands out more. That's why I had to stop and write down certain quotes a lot from a number of people. Triple H said he's going to show you what he wants you to see. And that's coming from his son-in-law, but that's true. And that's the thing. Did you see the footage of Vince in production meetings, Vince when they're working, Vince producing, the pencil in his hand or whatever? You still look, there's not a hair out of place. There's no wrinkles in his suit. His tie is perfect. He's not a loosen my tie and roll up my sleeves kind of guy. When he would get in the car, he would be the last one to put his stuff in the trunk so that he could take his suit jacket, and he had a special way of folding it inside out where the lining was out, where not only wouldn't it get wrinkled, but also he would get a speck on the outside of his jacket. It would be on the lining, and then he would lay it like carrying a newlywed across the threshold over the top of everybody else's bags and stuff, so it's right on top in a trunk, and close the lid. Is that a person that needs to be investigated by some type of authorities?
Well, he's obviously quite meticulous, and he's obviously a narcissist. So maybe, who knows? I mean, that's just the start.
Well, but anyway, that's the thing is you would see him sweat when he was on television, right? But God damn it, when he was just being a normal person, you wouldn't even see him sweat, except if he was working out. But I mean, he's there in the tie and the jacket and the production meeting, and I'm sitting there, my fucking balls are itching. He's not scratching shit. Anyway, they made clear that this program was being released, and all of the footage that they shot with Vince, and I assume Shane, Stephanie, Linda, the family members, was done before the first NDA broke. We talked about that the other day on the show. We were prefacing this thing, and it was right before the final interview they were going to do with him. And as a result, he didn't do no more interviews. I wonder what they would like to have asked him that when they got down to the end of the thing that they didn't get a chance to in that last interview.
I guess it would primarily be about all the women and all these stories.
Well, but did they know that at this point?
You're saying for the last interview after these things came out, he canceled that last interview. That would have changed the...
Well, but what had they been planning? Because they had the last interview scheduled when the shit came out, and then he said, oh, fuck it, I ain't doing it. So I wonder what they were going to ask him before all this shit came out.
And again, you have to remember who's behind this. This is a Bill Simmons documentary. He's the guy who started 30 for 30 at ESPN. He has a company now, The Ringer. That David Schumacher idiot.
Who have we ever figured out who this fucking guy is? David Shoemaker, that has an opinion on wrestling when nobody's ever heard of him?
That made up facts. I shouldn't even say facts. Made up stories in the Andre the Giant documentary that never happened. That was produced by Bill Simmons. That's the common trait. He's the in-house wrestling expert. And I guess, historian for Bill Simmons. The problem is, I don't know a single wrestling historian in the history of wrestling historians that thinks anything of this guy because he doesn't know anything. And he just talks gibberish. And I think a lot of his role here was specifically to tie things together because they didn't have someone to say the things they needed.
Just sit Shoemaker down and tell him to say this shit. That way our story makes sense.
But these are the guys behind it. So when you ask about a last interview with Vince, I don't know. I don't know because I don't think there's a deep wrestling knowledge in the making of the documentary from the production side. And again, the Andre the Giant documentary, it's a Bill Simmons thing, and they got a lot of credit for it, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. This Shoemaker just lied and made stuff up that Andre was a touring heel in the territories.
I remember that. Well, he just didn't know what he didn't even say a touring heel. He just didn't know what he was talking about. He said, yeah, he'd go from town to town and wrestle the top hero star. No, he didn't. But anyway,
idiot. What an idiot.
Well, that's the thing is that I wanted more insight from, and Uncle Dave is on there. Uncle Dave actually sounds like the voice of reason here. He had less hair dye than Vince also.
Well, it makes you wonder when he dyed his hair if this was the reason, because Dave's hair was darker than it should be there. But I thought Dave did a good job here. Dave, at a few points, was a necessary fact checker, because obviously no one else was going to do that.
Well, and you have people, and we'll see old Phil Mushnick here, I think, in episode 2. Unfortunately, he's still alive and kicking. But you have people that are just really egregiously to one side of the issue, and then you have Vince and the family that are going to be egregiously to the other side. So it's nice to have somebody's kind of halfway in the middle. But again, some of the comments, Vince saying, joking, supposedly, I don't want anybody to really know me. But that was another one of those double meaning statements after, everything that's happened. And I think that, did you hear what Brett said? Well, I was a true artist. How did I know?
Oh, Brett's my favorite one in this whole series. Again, I've watched more than one episode so far. Brett's the best one in this whole thing.
Well, and the thing is, Tony Atlas ain't doing bad.
Tony Atlas is great, and Tony Atlas tells the truth. Brett is so blunt and doesn't give a fuck.
Yeah.
And he just says the truth, even if it's putting himself over, which sounds like a braggadocious statement until you realize he's actually telling the truth.
Well, I know it. And the thing is, he was an artist, but it's just so funny to hear somebody actually call themselves an artist. And Bob Costas, he had kind of a decent explanation for what wrestling was.
From St. Louis, important to note, right? Isn't he from St. Louis? So that's wrestling at the Chase.
But also, he made the point, I think, in episode 2 again, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, that he liked the wrestling of the mid-'80s, but by the 90s, it had gotten, with all the bullshit going on, it had gotten troubling and changed, and it kind of did. Paul Heyman said Vince Sr. was the Pope of Madison Square Garden, which is kind of, again, Paulie has the way with words. But the whole thing, I still have not got enough on the childhood. And that is the origin story of this super villain. His childhood in the trailer park, not meeting Vince Sr. till he was 12. The incredible inferiority complex that boomerangs all the way back into the goddamn superiority complex where he always has to be in control. The bias against Southern people, things, ideals, whatever, Southern wrestling, anything that reminds him of the trailer park and the stepfather who we still, what did this guy do for a living besides beat his son up?
He drank and he beat Vince up all the time.
Well, but that's the thing. Is there anybody still living that knew this fucking guy that could say, he was okay until he got brain damage from getting hit in the head with a hammer, or he was always an asshole? How did Vince's mother meet this guy, how did Vince's mother meet Vince Sr.? But apparently not, for long or whatever the fuck. This whole dynamic that created this is the reason for all of Vince's issues. You can trace them back and nobody digs deep.
Well, we've seen a few efforts recently, and one of them is a little reminiscent of this. But Brad Baluchian in the Six Pack, tried to research the rise of Vince and the rise of the WWF, the national expansion, and came up with a lot of new info that wasn't publicly available. And then Abraham Josephine Reisman or Reisman, I'm not sure, the book, I think Ringmaster. Remember, the best part of that book by far was the research into Vince's childhood and debunking a lot of the myths that Vince put out there about him being a tough street fighter and all of these things. No one in the town remembered that. And much like the documentary, at least up to the point I'm watching so far, the Ringmaster book quickly goes from talking about Vince, the human being as a child, the road to wrestling, to everything's just about him and the wrestling. We don't get really anything about the personal life, about what it was like at home growing up a McMahon. Again, maybe that's on one of the later episodes, but so far,
I don't think it's going to be, because I don't think anybody else was there that is still around. Vince won't go into details. He's always made allusions to things and how, bad he was mistreated, but he's not sitting down. Okay, here's the family tree. Now, when my mother met Vince McMahon Sr., they were taking a trip in a Cadillac LaSalle or what. That's the thing. And he didn't even know his name was McMahon until he was 12 years old and he met Vince Sr. But he wouldn't, on this program, he wouldn't even call his stepfather by name. Remember his quote in, was it the Playboy magazine interview, was, "I wish he had lived long enough so I could have murdered him." So, but that's the thing. And when he said when he met Vince Sr., there was no hug. But he immediately fell in love with his dad. He had kind of a glow about him.
Like the Pope. The Pope.
And and he never talked with his father about why he wasn't there. All those, years of his childhood. One would have thought he would have got some story from his mother.
Well, I think that may be the reason why Vince Sr. wasn't there. Was Vince Sr. and the mother, it didn't work out. And Vince moved on and he moved away. He wasn't going to live in a trailer park. He wasn't going to live in North Carolina.
Well, but here's the thing. Was the mother living in a trailer park in North Carolina? When she knew Vince Sr., did she end up there because that didn't work out? All these details. Well, who did he blame for ending up where the fuck he was?
Yeah, we never got to hear, because I guess he died a few years before this, we never got to hear Rod McMahon's story, Vince's brother.
Yes, the only people that are talked to on this are Shane and Stephanie, who were kids. They weren't there. Linda, she met Vince when he was 16. He had already met Vince Sr. when he was 12. That was the military school years for him, wasn't it? 16 and up or whatever. But by that point, she says he always wanted to be involved in the wrestling business like his father. But she didn't know him before he knew who the fuck his father was, otherwise than this asshole stepfather. So I'm saying psychiatrists could trace a lot of this shit back to whatever the fuck was going on at that point. And then he said he always talked business with his dad, even when he was a teenager. No baseball, no whatever. Maybe was Vince Sr. the workaholic that Vince Jr. is, but Vince Sr. was always thought of as a more kind-hearted individual than Vince Jr. So was that the difference, but they were the same about business?
I don't know. I mean, Vince Jr. admitted that he had an obsession with wrestling from the moment he discovered that his dad had something to do with wrestling. I don't know what outside topics he'd be chit-chatting about. What other topics or hobbies does Vince Jr. have then or now?
I don't think Vince Sr. was a bodybuilder.
I think wrestling was the thing that really tied them together and made the relationship work. Even though the way Vince Jr. describes it here wasn't, necessarily there weren't a lot of hugs or anything.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was working side by side with him for years.
Well, and then...
And they didn't even mention Cape Cod, by the way.
Well, they did real Bangor, Maine was basically their gloss over of the Cape Cod Coliseum and the whole, tryout thing. But that's what I was going to go to next is besides the part where Linda said, well, we met, he was 16, I was 13, and there's no mention of how Vince had to be sent to the military school. And then when he got out trying to apprentice and the brief, mention of Vince Sr. said, hey, there's a building up in, Cape Cod, the Cape Cod Coliseum. Vince was the manager of that building, not just for promoting wrestling, but managed the building and other events that came there and blah, blah, blah. And that was the first time his old man had tried to set him up with something.
That was the first time he did what he would later do with the WWF shareholders, which is he got the Cape Cod Coliseum. He didn't put any money down. He just agreed to pick up whatever the ongoing mortgage payments were.
And so they jumped ahead from, well, we had this awkward meeting when I was 12 and, I met my dad to kind of almost no explanation, but just a nod to Cape Cod. And
that Ray Morgan was a greedy bastard. That was the next thing.
Automatically, what was that, 1972, 3?
72, I think. 72, okay. I think.
So they skipped pretty much ahead from when Vince met Vince Sr. to when he was, 26 years old or whatever. So I think there could have been more involvement there, but then again, besides taking Vince's word for it, and maybe Linda, who else, is around that was around. But when Ray Morgan was the unnamed previous television announcer that wanted more money, and Vince Sr. said, fuck it, you're done. And that was ballsy because Ray Morgan at the time had been doing that program for 10 years or more. He was the voice.
Yeah, more since the late 50s.
Yeah, so 15 years at that point. So he was the voice to the wrestling fans, and suddenly here comes, Vince, and even Bruce. Bruce said he had to tell the truth about this. Vince was a rotten announcer, but he could tell the stories.
See, I don't think Vince was a rotten announcer when he was trying to be Howard Cosell. I think he became a rotten announcer when he took over, and all of a sudden the type of announcer he could make himself was the screaming, yelling, excited guy.
Yes.
And I think that's when he was really kind of just not very good. But I like Vince McMahon, the neutral Howard Cosell-like announcer on those episodes. He's so milquetoast, it's amazing.
At least he didn't have to wear a toupee like Cosell. But
he used to like to have people joke about that. Jesse Ventura always said that Vince would tell me, make fun of my toupee. But he didn't have a toupee.
Exactly. But his hair was so perfect, it looked fake. And that was the thing I was going to mention also, besides glossing over, well, his father had set him up, managed the building up there. And, then the announcing thing, they skipped over, even when talking about WrestleMania, which we'll get to in a while when they get to it. They skipped over Vince being involved in the Evel Knievel, the Snake River Canyon jump, which was closed circuit television.
And Muhammad Ali Inoki. That was Vince Jr. who put that together.
Well, because Ali and Inoki, Evel Knievel was 1974. Ali and Inoki was 1976. There was still no pay-per-view television technology. But the wrestling promoters had gotten convinced to go along with it, and Vince Sr. had, but nobody really made any money on it because the wrestling fans in America had no idea who Inoki was. I mean, there's been books written about this. Everybody can go read one. But nobody knew who Inoki was in this country, he was paying Ali to come over there and to supposedly do a job for him to make him a big star in Japan. But when the American wrestling promoters heard about it at first, they're like, my God, Muhammad Ali on closed circuit with wrestling. And so they got in on it, but most everyone didn't make any significant money because the closed circuit in this country didn't draw. But in the Northeast, that's how Vince Sr. saved the day. He had talked Bruno into coming back out of the hospital from his broken neck early to work with Stan Hansen in the grudge match, and they did 35,000 people at Shea Stadium. It wasn't because of Ali and Inoki. It was because of Bruno and Hansen.
And again, the deal was Vince Jr. and Bob Arum, right? Weren't they the guys who put it together?
Yeah. And
so he was always ambitious.
It was a boxing model. So later on, when they get to the WrestleMania story, it wasn't as far-fetched that, he would think of something like this and just instead of going on a vacation for 2 weeks and, oh, golly. But anyway, I love the old footage. They went deep in the WWF library. We haven't seen a lot of this stuff, but it looks fucking fantastic. Even Bruno and Zbyszko, that footage, I don't remember them just throwing it out every goddamn week. Do you?
Well, that footage is actually popular. That was on like their first best of WWF videotape, and then it went away for a lot of years when Bruno fell out with them. But, they've remastered it and brought it back a few times. But Vince that's the thing. On commentary there, I don't think Vince was a problem. Vince was getting the whole story over.
Yeah.
What did you want? What do you want, Ed Whalen?
Oh, come on. I didn't mean to offend you.
I'm not saying you. I'm saying Bruce. He was listening to Paul Bosch. With all due respect, he's going to talk about bad commentators. Paul Bosch, a great promoter. Was he good on the mic as a commentator?
Well, not really. Not really, no. But anyway, then there was no mention of Vince Sr. getting cancer. It's just, he said, my old man was going to sell the company to get out of the business. He wanted to sell to Gorilla Monsoon, but I made the deal instead.
Yeah, and apparently there'll be a lot more about that in the Gorilla Monsoon biography that Brian Solomon, I think he just finished writing it.
Yes.
It'll be out next year.
And I was about to say, it wasn't really as simple as that Vince 2-sentence statement there.
And they set it up to tell the story for a minute, and they never did. Gorilla Monsoon was the heir apparent. Gorilla Monsoon was the person that Vince Sr. thought he was going to sell the company to. Vince Jr. makes this sweetheart deal with his dad. And it needs to be said, Linda said it more than anyone else I've ever heard.
Yes, she did, yes.
I've never heard anyone from the company or the family ever admit it like she did. They paid for it out of the company profits. The income that was coming in for running Boston and Philadelphia and New York City and everywhere else.
You run the company from here on out and pay me for it with the money that you take in the fucking business that I've already set up. How the fuck could that possibly have failed?
Yeah, again, his dad gave him a sweetheart deal, and that wasn't just said, and it needed to be. And then the other partners were all paid and all went away. I mean, Arnold Skolin hung around for a lot of years, but he wasn't a partner anymore.
Well, no, but they were all paid, but they continued to get paid.
Well, the biggest case of that is Gorilla Monsoon, who got whatever, for his shares from Vince, but then also not only continued employment, but when they were running 3 shows, sometimes even 4 shows a night, he had a deal where he got 1.5 times the preliminary money.
Yes.
For every single show they ever run.
Yes.
So he made off better than Vince Sr. on that deal.
He was making tens of thousands of dollars a week in the 80s. To not wrestle anymore. And that's why, Gorilla was smart. Gorilla had been... he was Gorilla Monsoon in the ring, but he was Gino Morella with the glasses on and the pocket protector and a nerd from college in the early 60s. And he saved his money and figured all that stuff out and had a piece of the company and got paid for that, plus paid till pretty much the day he died for a variety of other things. But Arnold Skolin still went to some of the towns. White Plains, that was Artie's town. He checked up. He gave you the draws. He sat in the locker room and smoked his cigars and played cards with the boys. But if you went to the Westchester County Center, you were working for Arnold Skolin.
Phil Zacco fucked off right away. He said, I'll see you later.
Yeah, he said, fuck it. Yeah. Well, he didn't like hanging around the boys as much. But that was the thing, Vince Sr. There's people that Jack Lanza had a job until he didn't want a job anymore. People that Vince had to take care of. But they didn't mention that, Vince Sr. getting cancer and being motivated in that way. Vince Jr. said, I didn't want to be pro wrestling. I don't like that term today. Well, thankfully we can say it again because you're not running the fucking show. But this was, I think they could have gone into a little bit more, but it was pretty much said by Tony Atlas and a variety of people. Everybody, the wrestlers, Vince Sr., they thought Vince was crazy and they didn't like his ideas. Now, he wasn't crazy. He made a ton of money in the end, but they still didn't like his ideas because it wasn't wrestling. They even said that it wasn't wrestling when they were showing the TNT Tuesday Night Titans talk show. The guys at that point, they didn't want to be doing that shit, but the guys paying them. But nobody wanted to do that shit because it wasn't wrestling. And many of them, probably, besides the money they made, still didn't want to do it because it wasn't wrestling, but they did it. But it wasn't he didn't. When he started going in the territories, Vince Sr. didn't like that. And I think Vince didn't understand it wasn't that he was competing with the other promoters. He was competing against the business. They all knew that if he did what he was going to do, which has been proven factual, if he did what he was going to do, you couldn't run wrestling companies anymore. It had to be that shit or nothing. And who else could run that shit?
Well, the other thing, too, about Vince Sr. complaining, it's always been interesting in terms of the timeline because the story's always been that Vince Sr., Vince Jr., who owned the company and no one knew it really yet, and Jim Barnett quit the NWA at the NWA meeting in September, I think, 1983.
Yeah.
There's no mention of any of that, but Vince was already in charge. At that point, no one knew it. They had already gone to LA. They had already gone to San Francisco. San Francisco was a Vern town, so that was right up against Vern. At the end of 83, he gets to St. Louis TV, makes the moves into Minneapolis, gets their talent, and starts growing. Vince dies. Vince Sr. died in May of 84?
I think so.
So, I mean, it happened pretty quick for, everyone's like, oh, Vince Sr. was against it and he had problems with it. But then he said, fuck it, screw them or whatever. When did he say that?
Yeah, see, Vince said, well, my dad finally said he was proud of me when I started beating all these other promoters, but his dad died before he really started beating any of those promoters. He got towns and he got other people's talent, but
unless he's talking specifically about Ole Anderson, because Ole was the first one to make a really big stink about those towns in not Cincinnati, but Pennsylvania, West Virginia,
Ohio, West Virginia. Yeah,
those were the towns that were the first ones really up for grabs from companies that had national TV presence.
Yeah, so I think that all of these things can be true. Vince Jr. does remember that Vince Sr. congratulated him once and said, I'm proud of you one time, because he probably beat somebody in some town. He hadn't won the whole goddamn thing yet. And at the same time, I think all the boys, they didn't want to expose the business and or go into entertainment to the extent that Vince did, because they knew that it would hurt everybody else's business, which it did. And they knew that they weren't going to work for this guy forever. Yes, a lot of people went for, the money because Vince was offering it, blah, 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 but they weren't. I was in the business at the time and hearing people talk. It wasn't like We're going to work for Vince McMahon for the next 20 years for the rest of our fucking careers. It was like, holy shit, they're making a fortune up there. We got to go. But they also didn't want that to be the only place that they ever fucking had the chance to wrestle again and make any money. And some guys saw that as being what was going to happen. Anyway, meanwhile, Hulk Hogan said Shea Stadium sold out with me and Andre.
Him and Andre sold out Shea Stadium. News to Bruno and Zabisco, who didn't sell out Shea Stadium.
Yeah, but who still drew a record crowd, and Hogan and Andre were underneath that main event. And Vince, I said to Vince Sr. didn't want Hogan and Rocky 3, but Vince Jr. did, because that was the thing. The kid was figuring out ways to do this better than his father, because he may love his father, but he can do it better. See, it's always been, Vince has to prove himself. The inferiority complex clouds everything. I've got to prove I'm bigger, stronger, faster, tougher, richer, whatever the fuck. I mean, there are things in this house that are still in the exact same place they were in 1957, because that's where my dad thought they should be. I never dreamed of changing anything that he would ever do.
Well, Vince would do the opposite. He would burn the house down.
Exactly. But he thinks in a bizarre fashion. Bruce explained the foreign menaces, the Germans, the Russians, the Japanese, the Iranian, when they were talking about the deal with putting the belt on Hulk from the Iron Sheik and Iran versus USA. But go ahead. What were you going to say?
Another thing they talked about publicly here was the idea that Vince's first choice was Dusty Rhodes, something we have heard before, something that Vince said to Brian Solomon years ago when he interviewed him.
And he said, what was the quote there? Because I remember it, but I didn't write it down.
Dusty didn't believe in it.
Dusty didn't believe in it. Because Dusty was like, no, we can't do that, baby. Dusty didn't believe in it. Because he...
What does that mean, though? Does that mean he didn't believe in going against the other territories? Do you take that as being, he doesn't believe in it being that?
I think so, yeah. I think, Dusty would not have wanted to, just work for a guy that said, we're going to control everything, we're going to run everything, or we're going to dominate everything, or we're going to go nationwide, and everybody else is, Dusty, whether he owed Eddie Graham or owed this guy or that guy, for putting him in that spot. I think as smart as Dusty, he wanted to be a booker and a creator, and he didn't want there to just be one place to do that either.
And again, the timing was perfect. Hogan was the right guy at the end, but Dusty in 83, he's booking Florida. He's getting ready to go leave and book for Crockett. So he's going to be leaving Florida. And you could tell he appears in lots of different places like Mid-South. He was almost trying to figure out what his next move was. And this was one of the options. And, again, it was the right move. It was the right move for Vince. Maybe it was the right move for Dusty, too, actually.
It was because, again, Vince's idea of what he wanted to present and how he wanted to do it did not mesh with Dusty's strengths, which was strong heat on heels, right? So that the hero could overcome, but it wasn't as kid friendly and as simple and good and, white hat, black hat as Vince. That's where I was going with the thing with Sheik and Hulk. Bruce kind of explained it, but they were almost like, well, this was a thing that Vince and the WWF came up with, these foreign menaces. It was the terrible Turk existed in the 1880s, right?
He was the biggest
in pro wrestling.
Yeah.
So it was natural xenophobia. Whoever we're in a war with, whoever there's strife with around the world with the United States, that's that person's countryman comes into wrestling, and we don't like him.
Again, going back to Dusty, though, what makes it interesting is we don't know when Dusty turned down the proposal or just said he didn't believe in it. But if it happened a few months earlier, there's a chance Because obviously Vince was not happy with Bob Backlund, didn't want that as his champion. That was his dad's champion.
Right.
And he couldn't put the belt on Snuka. And he didn't have Hogan yet. If Dusty had said in August, yeah, I'll come in, we may not get the Iron Sheik. There's always been rumors that maybe the Masked Superstar was going to get it and drop it to someone. I'm not saying it would have been that, but it worked out perfect for Hogan. If Dusty had said yes, you got to think Vince was going to get the belt off Backlund as fast as he could.
Yeah, and that was the Backlund thing was so typical of Vince Sr. To just say, well, I'm just going to leave this on him for years, right? Because we've talked about Backlund was quite a bit past stale at that point, but Vince Sr. didn't have to work for it anymore. New York, everything was selling out. But Vince Jr. knew that Bob Backlund was not going to get over in fucking Atlanta or Tampa or Dallas or whatever because he didn't have the history there that he'd had the previous 6 years in the WWF.
I guess here's a way to look at the difference. I'll ask you what you think. If Jimmy Snuka had murdered his girlfriend a year earlier, before the sale of the company to Vince Jr., would Vince Sr. have fired him, or would he have kept him around? Because that's one of the big differences there. Vince kept pushing him until eventually he couldn't a couple of years later, but you know, Bill Watts had to leave town in 60. I know it's it's a couple decades earlier, but he had to leave town when there was too much heat. They got him out of town. He never came back. You have to wonder if Jimmy Snuka had done all that stuff in 81 or 82 and he was already working there, would he have kept working there?
I think probably Vince Sr. would have probably have gotten rid of him because can you think of anybody else that Vince Sr. put up with shit like that, of that level, for any length of time? They didn't need to. And like I said, in those days, everything was selling out. They had an incredible run going in the Northeast. So if Bruno hadn't been gone that long, so I don't know that he would have kept Snuka. But, and then again, you know, Snuka would have not been the choice as champion because he couldn't say Suey if the Hogs had him. But what an attraction he was just to see him physically in person without having to listen to him.
And they didn't even bring up Japan, but Hogan at the same time, he became the biggest star in the AWA and he did Rocky 3. And give Hogan credit. That's a pretty brave move. If Vince Sr. says you're fired and you'll never come back, and he says, okay, I'm going to go make this movie, that's a big risk that he took. But again, he was a big star in Japan, so it wasn't just taking him from Verne Gagne. It was Vince really having to solidify the New Japan relationship, which from a financial level would be very important leading into WrestleMania. It wasn't mentioned here, but Hogan was the biggest star in New Japan amongst the Gaijin and the AWA at the same time.
And he was just, what, 6 months off of, or so at that point, was it off of knocking Inoki out with the Axe Bomber clothesline?
That was 83. That was 83,
so,
yeah.
It was for the first time in history, somebody had left Antonio Inoki laying, and he was over like God. But again, as you alluded to, and we'll move on, the New Japan booking deal for American talent from Vince, because the Funks booked NWA talent to Baba, that got Vince another $1 million to use on the first WrestleMania, right when he needed it. Anyway, I've got some notes. I mentioned Linda looks younger now. Boy, nobody else does, though.
Tony Atlas looks good for his age.
Well, that's true. But he doesn't
He's
look
one
like
of my favorite people. Anytime he's a talking head, he's brutally honest and funny at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he just did it like this, and he just say it flat out. But the story, they get into Cyndi Lauper and MTV and Mr. T, and that's been well documented, as they say also in other places. But then Vince says, well, Linda made me take a vacation. And I was gone for 2 weeks, and I thought of an annual show like our Super Bowl called WrestleMania. Bullshit.
Yeah, version, I've never heard of that story.
Well, and the thing is, again, we talked about earlier, it's not it wasn't ridiculous that Vince would think about a closed circuit promotional concept. He had done Ali and Inoki. He had done Evil Knievel, Snake River Canyon. He knew what he'd worked with Bob Arum. He knew what closed circuit was. There was no pay-per-view television.
He didn't come up with the name WrestleMania, though.
Well, and that's why he might very well have thought of a big event like our Super Bowl, and we could put it on closed circuit. Since they were already doing that with big boxing matches, it's not a fucking stretch. He didn't think of it as an annual event because they didn't know for sure they were not going to lose their ass on the first one until they didn't. But Howard Finkel named it WrestleMania. They didn't have a name for the fucking event. And Finkel, as everyone who ever knew him knows, being the biggest music trivia expert and oldies fan or whatever, Beatlemania, Hulkamania, WrestleMania. That's how it was. So it wasn't like it just came fully formed out of Vince's mouth when he came back from El Salvador, wherever he took a vacation to.
Yeah, how about those pics on the boat? Vince was jacked. Holy shit.
I know, it's ridiculous.
That's 85.
Yes, but he always wore the suits, but that's why his suits always looked like somebody had left the hanger in the jacket. Anyway, and then the John Stossel story again. And Vince still won't, fucking admit to anything. But did you notice, first of all, that Hulk had to claim credit for being the first one to tell Vince that Stossel was out for him?
They establish in the series that Hogan is a snitch.
So well, yeah, but how many times did he say, I made a beeline to Vince?
Yeah.
I went straight to Vince.
Well, I can believe that, though, because, again, he interviewed Hogan, the biggest star in the company, before the Garden Show. If that is indeed the proper timeline, I can understand why that would be concerning. That it's not just that he was trying to expose the business, but I think the offensive part to a lot of people was the smugness and the attitude from Stossel.
No, he was a complete fucking dick, and is probably a dick still to this day, because dicks usually, unless they get circumcised, don't really change that much. But so Hulk said, Stossel asked him, hey, do you guys really cut yourselves with a razor blade? So he said, I made a beeline to Vince. And then remember, we've talked about this before. He didn't need to go to anybody and say, you need to do this to this guy. Tony says he was in a locker room. Well, I wish somebody'd put this guy in his place, right? And I said, anybody knows David Schultz? Yes, talk to that guy over there. Conditions were forming to be right for the tornado warning to break out. And then they showed a clip of Stossel's report. Well, I hate to tell you people, but this is fake. Yeah, fuck you. That was everybody in the wrestling business, wrestlers, referees, managers, TV announcers, promoters, whatever. I don't care who you were. If in 1985 somebody said, I think wrestling's fake, your fucking head burst into flames. It's not like today where they're like, oh, you're right. Yeah, I'll show you how fake it is. Come here. We cared about the shit then. And there was nobody that was going to laugh at that, right? Not anybody. They were going to get pissed. It was just a degree of pissedness. But Schultz was a whole new level of fucking, that's what, Stossel deserved it, in my opinion, if for nothing else than, what the fuck do you think is going to happen when you walk up to a guy that looks like David Schultz and you tell him that he's a phony and his business is phony? How was that an unexpected result for John Stossel?
Again, what he said was, I think it's fake. That was what he said. I think it's fake. How's he supposed to respond?
I think it's fake. Yeah, well, I think I'm going to slap the shit out of you.
My favorite part, and they never mentioned it, is Mr. Fuji and the Iron Sheik in the background watching. They had to see it. Yes. They knew something was going to go down. They're like, let's go see this.
Well, yeah, everybody was standing there at Hall because they said this fucking little fucking prick is going to talk to Schultz. But again, how did John Stossel imagine that anything else would happen when you go up to a guy that looks like that and you start calling him names. So anyway, but Vince said, well, out of nowhere, Schultz just slapped him. And Atlas said, we all celebrated, all of us. And they did. And then the Richard Belzer clip again, because now they're starting to talk about all the publicity wrestling is getting and Vince is getting, but now some of the publicity's turning bad. I timed it. Because remember, we've done an in-depth breakdown on this before. Hogan had him for 6 seconds total, 3 seconds in a working way and 3 seconds of cinched up, and that put Belzer under. And that's because I guarantee you he had half of Bolivia or Colombia or wherever, Peru, wherever the good stuff comes from. He had a half of it in his fucking bloodstream. Because did you saw what you can tell when he cinched up from the regular one, right?
Oh yeah, you could see it. I mean, you see him grip it, and even when he first gets it in, and you see him put his hand on his wrist, across.
Yes.
You're like, oh man, Hogan's got a really good grip on this thing.
Well, yeah.
And then you see him grip it, and I don't think we're speaking out of school. Richard Belzer was known to be a hard partier, I guess, at that time.
Well, yeah, I don't care if anybody knows it or not. I'm just telling you from fucking my observation, that's what happened. His heart was going 1,000,000 miles an hour. The first 3 seconds of the front face lock was Hogan putting it on and showing him tightly without squeezing, and you could see Belzer's arm kind of go up like, oh, golly. And then you can see Hogan's looking at Mr. T off camera, and he says, what do you think, T? And he cinches up for 3 seconds and then lets him go, and boom.
Because that's the thing. If you watch the actual segment, you would have thought Mr. T was going to be the one to hurt him. Because him and T did not get along, and it was not like a good... You were getting a bad vibe from the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then Hogan does this, and they left out the best part when they returned from commercial, and it's Hogan, Mr. T, and the executive producer explaining that Richard's gone, he had to go to the hospital, and Hogan starts to, almost apologize, but explain, I was trying to do a move, these are real things, and then Mr. T's just not having it, just, he provoked us and everything else.
Well, see, that's the thing, because Mr. T could have punched him, but there's no plausible deniability in that. Oh, golly, I didn't realize when I punched him as hard as I could in the face, it would hurt him. But with Hogan say, oh, let me just dim it, because T didn't know any wrestling moves or any wrestling holes. T could say, well, let me just show you what, or Hogan could say, let me just show you what we do all the time. And oh, golly, that hurt you? See, that's how, but he still got sued and still, Belzer got money to buy a house, right?
Yeah, but again, that was not necessarily something you would want to happen. The David Schultz, John Stossel thing, same thing, but they both lent themselves to the whirlwind of publicity that was happening around WrestleMania happening. Because the Belzer thing was right before it.
Yeah, I watched it in my apartment in Dallas. I was still working in World Class and remember plain as day seeing that.
It didn't hurt WWF that those things happened. It helped them.
Yes, because it was publicity. But it was starting to, there could be things go wrong. And then, that's what Vince said. I don't know if it was good for the industry, but it was good for my business. That's all I cared about. That's the thing. Even a lot of these other promoters, yes, they always wanted their business to do good, but they didn't want to do something that would be bad for the whole industry because everybody depended on it. And Vince didn't care as long as I'm competing.
Well, with him, the business doesn't mean the business. It just means his business.
His business, yes.
And, it's a weird, you want to talk about an insecure thing or insecurities of Vince McMahon, always having to be in the suit and everything, but just the constant references to, I'm a businessman, or this is how we do business, and this is business. Your background was working for your dad and selling calculators. Like, stop pretending like you're the expert in this. He'd created a way that he thought he had to be to portray the character behind the scenes that he needed to be.
Well, anyway, but now we had families, Brian. That's what Hulk said. We didn't have the cigar smoking beer drinkers anymore in the audience. We had families. We always had families. There's a goddamn family of people in the Louisville Gardens. There was 4 different generations sat ringside the same seats every week before Hulk Hogan stepped in a wrestling ring. But that's the story that then all the news reports, you'd say, well, wrestling is making a comeback from second-rate arenas to the big buildings or whatever.
You would hear all these things about the smoky arenas. Vince McMahon ran the same arenas.
Yes, and Vince Sr. ran those arenas, and that's where Vince Jr. got the money to buy Vince Sr. out, was from the old arenas that Sr. was running.
See, do you think the documentary, I mean, up to this point so far, we're still in episode 1, did they do a good enough job of explaining the genius of Vince McMahon's promotional wing, the ability to lie to the press and know that they'll probably run with it?
I think that if you know what's going on, you could see that, but I don't think they actually came out and spelled it out that, no, this shit had been tremendously popular, but this guy came along and said, well, I'm going to fucking do it a different way, and it's all about me, and then, they ran with that. But in all honesty, nationwide, I would think that wrestling had probably even been stronger in 77, 78, 79 than it probably was in 80, 81, or 82. Even though a lot of towns were still doing great. And then in 83, things started taking off, but it wasn't all centered around Vince. Dusty went to Crockett and created Starrcade. Hogan started working for Vern, and they were doing massive houses in St. Paul. A lot of different things happened, but Vince was able to, take all the credit and all the publicity off of this resurgence in wrestling that had really never been away. People just weren't talking about it in the media. But that was episode 1, Junior.
Again, the very beginning of it, they reference the later scandals, and that's the only reference, for the most part, throughout the episode. Did you think it did a good job of laying the foundation for the rest of the series?
Yeah, I think for good and bad, I think there's probably going to be more things left out that the wrestling fan, or at least the devoted historian fan, would want to hear about. But at the same point, this is 40-something years of a guy's life that's done everything. You can't do it in 6 hours even. And thankfully, it's not 12 hours. So again, I understand why things have to be left out. But every once in a while, you hear, and we've started hearing a few things dropped in. You hear some things that's like, well, no, okay, it actually didn't happen that way. But they're doing a wonderful job of production, and I love the footage.
Yeah, I think that was one of the pleasant things. I don't know, pleasant's the word, but
pleasant.
They didn't say the whole story, but sometimes when Vince said something, they didn't mind having someone there to say that wasn't true.
Yes. So they are, I don't see a burial yet. I don't see anything tremendously unfair yet. I see the most egregious thing about episode number 1 is that sometimes things that Vince just says or people say about what Vince has done as a matter of course are not challenged, but small details overall in the big picture.
Well, there it is, the review of episode 1. We shall return momentarily with the review of episode 2.